You're nice.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. We are here meeting up for the second live session for this course on environment and development. Uh, Please do log in and then post your question query if there is any in the chat box. So meanwhile, I'll try to give a brief summary of what we have done in last couple of weeks. So we began looking at in the fourth week religion and environment. Uh, so in this, we try to look into the role played by religion in the sense by taking into consideration about some of the uh, religion mostly beginning from the what is being argued by Lynn White Jr. as Christianity, which is being partly considered to be, the anthropocentric in nature, which is responsible for the ecological crisis which we are confronting with now. Because he goes on to trace the root of our historical crisis, and some of the questions which we have tried to address in this particular theme is that how has religion shaped our understanding and often our conduct towards nature, and how has the environmental crisis challenged and transformed modern theology and spiritual practice, and what have the world's faiths believe about the human relation to nature, and how must belief and actions change as we face the environment. So considering this, we have, as I mentioned, tried to situate these by taking into a few religions, including some of the Asian religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. Now, what the first point which Lin White Jr. has tried to argue is that the marriage between science and technology, that is the union of the theoretical and the empirical approaches to our environment, the natural environment, to a large extent has shaped our imaginations, and which is also partly, responsible for what we have confront, that is our ecological crisis, which is also perhaps, seen to be because of the fusion of science and technology. And he goes on to look at the notions of human and nature that is beginning from the medieval period, how land is being conceived, and how human relations to the soil has profoundly changed. Because earlier it was perceived that man has been the part of nature, and now he has transformed himself to be, the exploiter of nature. So man and nature are two things, and man eventually has, transformed as the masters. So what people do about the ecology is large, by and large, depends on what they think about themselves and in relation to things around them. So in a way, human ecology is deeply conditioned by belief about our nature and destiny, that is by religion. So one of the important points which is particularly raised by Linva Jr. is that the victory of Christianity over paganism was perhaps the greatest psychic revolution in the history of our culture. So that is where it begins, and then how Christianity has shaped our imaginations, and also about the way in which we relate ourselves with environment. He goes on to, the stories of creation, and also how Christianity has been in absolute contrast to some of the insane paganism and Asia's religions, which not only try to, establish a dualism of man and nature, but also it tries to uh, insist that it is God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. So therefore, the religious study of nature for a better understanding of God was even, I mean, initially perceived as natural theology and so on and so forth. So Lin White Jr. has also critically looked at the way in which the Christian worldview has shaped and how human nature relationship has changed over time, and particularly blame Christianity for the mess which it created. So then move on to looking at the conservation ethics, which is being embedded in the context of Buddhism and Hinduism. So Buddhism, to a large extent, views humanity as an integral part of nature, so that when nature is defiled, people tends to suffer. So therefore, the negative consequence arises when cultures alienate themselves from nature, and when people feel separate from and become aggressive towards the natural system. So in other words, we can say that when we abuse nature, we also abuse ourselves in the process. So therefore, Buddhism, to a large extent, in some of its texts, like the Jataka, has by and large, give a vivid account of how humans have been very close to nature, and they have been, by and large, followed a strict rule in terms of nature conservation. And therefore, we have also looked into some of the precepts of Buddhism, more or less on water conservation, and then move on to Hinduism and nature conservation. So we have also looked into some of the ancient texts, such as the Yajurveda, which describes about how a human tends to share a very close affinity with nature. And in fact, in the one of the Atharva Veda, that is it is being highlighted that the earth is not for human beings alone, but for other creatures as well. So therefore, we have looked at some of the texts and try to familiarize ourselves to what extent some of these religion has addressed and advocated some of the doctrine of ahimsa, that is professing about non-violence. So ahimsa, to a large extent, provides a solid foundation, that is the non-violence, not simply against humans, but also against the non-human entities, including animals and so on and so forth. So many of these Hindu scriptures place a strong emphasis on the notion that God's grace can be received by not killing his creatures or harming his creations. So therefore, a lot of portions in the Rig Veda also talk about the tree worship and then respect for flora, and the cutting of trees and destruction of flora was perceived to be a sinful act. And we have also engaged with some of the examples, particularly by citing the Bisnois community, who practice a religion of environmental conservation. Now, going back to where we begin, where Lin White tried to provide and close affinity or unmistakable link between the rise of science, that is through the Judeo-Christian tradition, wherein the White argued that since the roots of our troubles are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. So therefore, it tries to see that we need to address the issue and then deconstruct and rectify the wrong which has been done in the past. So eventually, we also refer to the message which is given John Paul II, that is the ecological crisis, which is a common responsibility, wherein some of the portions which has been argued by Lin White Jr. has been to a large extent, negated and corrected by Pope John Paul, where we need to also seriously think about the way in which we perceive and interpret the text from the biblical passages. And one of the most profound and serious indications of the moral implications underlying the ecological problem, perhaps, is the lack of respect for life, which is evident in many patterns of the environmental pollution. So, therefore, respect for life and above all, for the dignity of human person, perhaps, is the ultimate guiding norm for any sound economic, industrial, or the scientific progress. So Pope John Paul also goes on to the extent of discussing about or the clarion call about establishing a peaceful society and the urgent need for solidarity. So the ecological crisis is to a large extent set within the broader context for the search of peace. So therefore, he sum up by saying that since the ecological crisis is a moral issue, so it requires every stakeholders to come together and comes to find a solution to it. So we then move on to discuss about natural resource management, how natural resources are important, and to what extent natural resource has been managed. And we also engage upon some of the issues concerning the conservation of biodiversity, and also engages upon some of the way in which natural resource has been managed, and some of the community-based natural resource management by citing some literatures. And more importantly, in this section, we have also looked into the debate, that is the common property versus the private property, that we began looking at the American ecologist Gary Hardin's paper, which talks about the tragedy of the commons, which tries to situate that happens when two or more activities that produce results depend for their success on some limited benefits. So the tragedy of the commons to a large extent explains the reason why growth stops or declines after a period of time because of the limited sources which are shared among groups or individuals. So tragedy of the commons, Garrett Hardin argues that because the actors do not pay attention to the effects of their actions, therefore they continue their undesirable behavior until it's too late to undo or fix the resource. Whereas on the other hand, to give a rebuttal to what Garrett Hardin has posited, Elinor Ostrom in her book Governing the Commons include examples of how local communities would be able to do this without the top-down regulations of private actions. So therefore, there is a debate over the private versus the common property, where the private property is considered by most economists to be an essential ingredient in economic development due to the incentives associated with diverse kinds of property relationships. So therefore, we have to a large extent engaged in this debate, where we also say that, for example, deforestations are often perceived to be results from social injustice and political inequalities. So therefore, some of these questions arises as to what form of property rights should be adopted. whether it should be private property rights, state property rights, or common property rights. So this common property theory actually is also to look at the relationship between the indigenous people and forests, that is how ownership rights in relation to forests are broadly distributed in different parts of the world. So forests are again being seen as a forest-based commons, where forests are an important source of livelihoods to the poor, and where the forest common resources are also, seen to be a safety net or a food security for many of the communities in the global south. So livelihood forests and conservation is also one theme which we have looked into, where the survival of households mostly depends upon their access to these crucial resources and also the utilization of these resources. So we also look into some of the socio-economic development, livelihoods and forests, the social and political characteristic of forest-dependent people, and how non-timber forest products are also, an important components for peoples mostly in the global south. So therefore, in the situations where depletions of resources takes place, then it is these people who are usually at the receiving end. So then we also move on to look at some of the way in which where for any programs such as poverty alleviation schemes or any other programs, then forest conservation to a large extent plays an important role. And we also look at how gender, forest, and livelihoods are being interlinked. And we also look into the changing nature of ownership and control over forests, which happen to have a significant gender implications. So the impact of deforestation, for instance, and commercialization of forest products on has a rising burden on women particularly. So we also cited examples of forest and livelihoods concerning Northeast India, where livelihoods in northeastern regions are critically dependent upon the environmental entitlements. It tries to look into the way in which access and control and ownership of resources. So we have also delved into the issues of conservation-induced displacement, where the nature conservation idea of wilderness has to a large extent goes on to establish the modern days of these national parks and so on and so forth. And where one of the implications is perhaps displacement. So, and then displacement to a large extent has been often, synonymized whenever we discuss about development. So the policy response to development-induced displacement and resettlements are some of the growing concerns whenever some of the developmentalists or developmental experts talks about. So conservation and displacement again is something which is more or less synonymous. That is, displacement is perceived to be a consequence of conservation process, because conservation, like development, is inherently spatial in nature. So we also could see that there is a growth rate of protected areas which has been steady over the past few decades. So therefore, conservation displacement, like other forms of displacement, could be seen in terms of the forced removal of people from their homes, and then there is economic displacement, that is the exclusion of people from the particular areas in their pursuit of livelihood and so on and so forth. So we have also discuss about the conservation-induced displacement by taking the case of the one Gujarat and the Sariska Tiger Reserve. So I'm not going into details of that. So where the Sariska Tiger Reserve happens to be an example of where the conservation-induced displacement has taken place. So we also look at some of the environmental impact assessment and national rehabilitations and resettlement policies. So we have also looked at some of the stages in which the EIF would necessarily involve, and the strategic environment assessment, the stakeholders in the EIF process, or maybe the environmental impact assessment in the context of India. And we have also critically looked at the National Rehabilitations and Resettlement Policy of 2007. We then move on to discussing on the theme mining development and indigenous peoples, how mining in this induced displacement has taken place, and where there is a large-scale acquisition of land, which happened to be one of the most important driver of this displacement. So as I said, when we say displacement, it is usually the forcible eviction and dispossession, for example, in this context about the coal mining regions of India. So mining-induced displacement and resettlement is primarily an economic issue, which are usually associated with loss or significant reductions of access to these basic resources, namely land, pastures, forests, and clean water, on which the communities has depend for their sustenance. So we have looked at some of the mining, activities in India and the legal policies and laws, and the impact of mining are large, not just limited to land degradation, water and air pollution, marginalization and food insecurity, social and cultural risk, but also it poses a threat to people, specifically, the indigenous communities by and large. So we have goes to the extent of giving examples of mining in Jharkhand, where the impact of mining, for instance, the exploitations of mineral resources, owing to the large-scale mining operations going on in the region, have adversely affected the groundwater table in many areas, and also how the adjoining villages has drastically reduced. So we have also looked into some of the victims of development, that is because of the large-scale exploitations of natural resources, then it has adversely affected the lives and livelihood of the indigenous people, particularly in the state of Jharkhand. And in the process, they are being dispossessed of their political autonomy, and their communities broken up in the nature of, in the name of development for the national interest. So in a sense, such forms of, large-scale exploitation of resources or displacement is perceived to be a new type of internal colonialism, which is being unleashed on them by the stated corporates or the ruling classes of the country. So this growth of mining activities in the region has acted as one of the most powerful stimulant in the emergence of new industries and in the growth of new urban centers. So I have at length given an example about the mining in the Nyamgiri Hills, why the Nyamgiri Hills is, so sacred to the Dongria Pond, because there is a critical and symbiotic relationship which is being shared between Dongria Pond and Nyamgiri forest. So therefore, both culturally and ecologically, the Nyamgiri Hills are extremely rich and significant. And we could see that there is and memorandum of understanding which is being signed between the Vedanta Alumina Limited and the Odisha Mining Corporation. And therefore, this proposed mining would, in a way, uproot these Dongria cons and deprive them of not simply about their life and livelihood, but also their socio-religious identity are being threatened. And we have also listed some of the biodiversity which are to be affected by these Nyangri, because a number of wild animals and then plants which are also being listed in the IUCN would be endangered and affected by this. So in some of the fact-finding team of the Central Land Power Committee, in their report, they also states that Nyangri is a very rich forest from the biodiversity point of view. So therefore, it tries to, suggested to declare this area as a sanctuary. So the Nyangri Hill ranges about, the lifeline of the Kalandi origin. So therefore, there is a close affinity which is being shared between the Dongrias, because they consider that their right to cultivate these hill slopes has been conferred to them by the Niam Raja, and unless the hills are tilled, one can hardly call himself a Dongri, because their cultural identity, in a sense, is being associated with the way in which they share that close affinity and relationship with the land, because the land in a way is the source of their sustenance. So the Dongria Konda's economy and its major sources of livelihood are directly related with the Nyangri forest. So some of the critical concern which arises because of mining, particularly in Nyangri Hills, is that one of the most ecologically biodiverse areas of the state, which are, which have a wide range of flora and fauna, rivers and streams, and it becomes even inhuman and anti-conservation when once there's a gross undervaluations of the close interaction between the local tribes concerned. So therefore, some of the impact of mining on the Nyangri would be that, particularly the bauxite mining probably destroys more surface area than mines of other materials. And among the major environmental impacts of bauxite mining are the implications of the disposal of the alkaline, and otherwise known as the red mud. So there's a lot of flora and fauna, as I have pointed out, and the indigenous people that is the Dongria Pond are to be adversely affected by the proposed bauxite mining project. So therefore, there is an anti-mining struggles that with the in the front they have come up with different kinds of protests. Development for us is being able to protect our hills, rivers, and jungle, and also slogans such as that our blood flow like a river, but we won't allow mining. So these are some of the issues in the context of Nyangri, and therefore they have been to a large extent successful in protesting against this. Therefore, a Supreme Court judgment in 2013 upheld the rights of these forest-dwelling Adivasis and the other forest-dwelling communities over there to uphold the deity Niyam Raja. So I've also discussed some of the case studies relating to dams development and resistance by taking a case mostly in Northeast India. And I begin trying to contextualize the security development nexus by way in which how the security development nexus unfolds and engages in how development discourse perhaps is the product of by taking the case of the study of the Tripoli Dam, and where the Mar identity or the Mar community has shared a very close affinity and relationship with the Barak region. So it is not simply a sacred site for the Mar communities, but also it is a socio-political economic lifeline, which are integral to these communities. So therefore, there is a strong objections voiced against the Tipaimun Dam from different perspectives. And some of the concern is that there is no prior informed consent. That is, the indigenous people oppose the project by contending that there has been no prior informed consent with people about the development project on their land. Today goes on to question the national development, the questions of why they should not be a part of this. And the other case which I have discussed is the controversial dam, beginning from its inception and the resistance of the dam project. So some of the issues which is being raised is the questions of the politics of land acquisitions and how this dam and development are entangled within these notions of this militarization. Take up the case of the competing visions which are surrounding the development along the Narmada River, that is the Saraswati Dam, where there is no discussions. So the case of the Saraswati Dam have invited public debate on how large dam has, been and which has caused havoc down around the business and massive scale. So, some of these issues, that is the competing visions, that is, while many of these dam advocates and opponents are generally sincere in their advocacy of sustainable development and social justice, what it means by the use of these terms and symbols differs from it. So these are engaged by looking at giving a critique of development to a large extent. So these are some of the things which briefly covered and in the last couple of weeks. So I look forward to hearing from you all, and then if there is any queries, you please feel free to drop in emails, or maybe in the next live session, I'll be happy to respond. So and also I request you all to regularly submit the assignment test, because there is also a part of the overall the evaluation process. I once again thank you all for enrolling for this particular course.